What I want to do today is talk about the second part, the middle section of Origins of Totalitarianism, which is what Hannah Arendt calls imperialism. So remember, the Origins is divided into three parts. The first part is anti-Semitism and her theories about that. That's what we did last class. And then part two is imperialism, and part three is totalitarianism. And in part three, everything is leading up to her explanation of the concentration camps, the death camps, and how that was the new sort of the lowest low of civilization. She puts that into the context of her political theory. We're going to look now in part two, which is imperialism, which is basically covering the period from the late 19th century, up to including World War I. There were two selections from that in the one-volume portable Hannah Arendt. So if you read it, great. If you didn't, and you want to read more about what I read today without reading the full middle section of Origins, it was in part two, Stateless Persons. It was the third part there, which is the second part, the perplexities of the rights of man. That's actually the very end of part two of Origins. And then in the next section, the second part of the totalitarianism section, which is called Expansion, which is sort of taken from the first chapter of part two of Totalitarianism. So those two sections are from part two. So they're both in here. So again, it's the one that's called Perplexities of the Rights of Man, and then the one that's called Expansion. So I selected a few passages, and in the short time that we had, I think I can go through and pick out a few things and see how they, the ideas that they raise. And she's writing at the beginning about expansion and how what happens to the nation state starting in the late 1800s is the growth of European imperialism and expansion. And she quotes the British imperialist Cecil Rhodes. It's the epitaph that the whole section starts with is, "I would annex the planets if I could." And that's that sense imperialism. It's just the more you have, the more you need. And that sense of just needing more and more and more expansion. And that's what she looks at and is analyzing through this section. And I'll just go through, this. She says, of all forms of government and organizations of people, the nation state is least suited for unlimited growth because the genuine consent at its base cannot be stretched indefinitely and is only rarely and with difficulty won from conquered people. So it's a systemic problem with imperialism that she puts out. She kind of makes a distinction between a classical empire, which is just a confederation of different peoples, right? Different peoples under one government, versus an imperialist empire, which we saw the great European powers engage in from the late 19th century, the British Empire, the French Empire, German Empire, the Russian Empire. As there, it's a mother country that is ruling over other countries. And the growth of the imperialism says there's a growth of as the nation states grew, they eventually became imperialist. But she's pointing out to the systemic problem with that, right? It's the problem of the organization, because the nation state, so let me just unpack what she wrote, is the worst type of government to run an empire, because the nation state is a state that preferences one nation, one people. So the other territories that it's conquering are not of that people, right? They're other peoples. So she says, so let me just read that again. So it says, the genuine consent at its base cannot be stretched indefinitely, right? You think about the political theory of the Enlightenment where it talks about the consent of the governed, right? You can get consent of the governed if it's a republic and it's your own people. But it's very difficult to get the consent of a different people that you want to govern that you do not consider a part of your nation. And it is with difficulty won from conquered people, right? It's very difficult to win consent from conquered people. Yeah.
We have something similar to that going on here today, where the melting pot that Daniel Patrick Moynihan
Right.
is kind of gone, and now we have an organization of many different
Right. Right. There are many different metaphors. They were saying for those watching that the Senator Moynihan's metaphor of the melting pot, which is sort of now we have, it's more sort of a balkanization, which is, so the melting pot is a pot where everything comes together and you have this common stew. And the problem with that is you're losing the duality. The Balkanization means, like the Balkans, all these little different countries, and everyone hates everybody else. A nicer metaphor that's often used as replacing the melting pot is the salad bowl, where they're not melted together. You have different ingredients, but they kind of do work together. So as opposed to Balkanization, it leads to World War I, which is not a good result. So we have those different choices there. Okay, so let me flip. Yes, Stacey, find the next part.
Isn't that what is happening in the world in the mid-20th century? That all the imperialists are having trouble being thrown out. I think of England and all the African countries that they took over. That's what's happening in the world in the 50s and the 40s. That countries that are lorded over are starting to feel.
Right. So the 40s and the 50s is the period that we call decolonization, right? Because the British Empire is no longer able to sustain itself because of the exhaustion of running two sequential world wars. So, and then it's built up within the independence movements of all the other nations there. So exactly. So that's the rollback of imperialism. We tend to end the imperialist period with World War I because that's sort of the blow up where it hits, but then it takes a while for the ideas to die, right? So Winston Churchill was still an imperialist, even though it's already post World War I. It takes until you only have the full you don't have fully. You still have areas that are controlled by the European powers today, but very few. You know, the biggest rollout of decolonization is right after World War II, and the best example is the British pulling out of India, which is their pride possession, and Indian independence is 1949. Yeah.
And then just to take all these discussion one step further,
47.
I understand Huntington in his Clash of Civilizations said it's no longer nation states, it's philosophies, it's cultures, it's that are go across boundaries and borders that are now conflicting in this post-empire world.
So post-empire is cultures conflict, right? But the
Cultures, not,
right.
not nation states.
Right, but you can have a culture, you can have a cultural interaction or conflict. What Arendt is arguing that's dangerous is when the state associates itself with one nation culture. So she's an anti-nationalist, right? Because that is when it gets dangerous, because then you have violence that goes in the service of one nation over other nations, that the state is employed by that. And that goes back to what the argument was in part one of anti-Semitism, that the reason why that the Jews, because they were not a part of any of the nations where they lived, always did well with the state, because they were the best, they were the most trustworthy by the state, because they were only loyal to the state. So then you had the individual elements that all hated the Jews because the Jews was associated with the state and they wanted their national element. The change especially in the 19th century, is the definition of a state becomes melded with a nation, right? That wasn't the case earlier. You think about, up to World War I, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was a multi-nation state, right? It had all different, it wasn't a nation state. But Germany is a nation state, Britain is a nation, France is a nation state. So it's those developments, it's not just cultures in clash, but then it's powers in clash.
But the disintegration of Sudan, Syria, all these countries, Iraq, in the Middle East, disintegration of the nation state.
Right.
They're developing the concept of common culture, is what is creating a lot of the violence in the world.
Yeah. Okay. Let me read another passage here. This was a very powerful passage. It talks about the problem because much of imperialism, she says, is driven by capitalism and the need to possess more and more property and more wealth. And more wealth you have, the more wealth that you need, the more assets that you need. She writes, the most radical and only secure form of possession is destruction. For only what we have destroyed is safely and forever ours. The corollary statement. The only thing you get to keep forever is something that you've destroyed. Property owners who do not consume but strive to enlarge their holdings continually find one very inconvenient limitation, the unfortunate fact that men must die. Death is the real reason why property and acquisition can never become a true political principle. Extraordinary comment. Let me finish it. A social system based essentially on property cannot possibly proceed toward anything but the final destruction of all property. The finiteness of personal life is as serious a challenge to property as the foundation of society, as the limits of the globe are a challenge to expansion, as the foundation of the body politic. Those are ideas that she develops in her later philosophical work, The Human Condition, that was written after this, where she expands there on her understanding of Marxism and property and labor, and correlates that to how political structures and how peoples interrelate with each other. She said how that it leads, that need to possess more is what leads the nations to engage in competition with each other, that ultimately leads to the clash of nations. Yeah.
I'd like that better to use the word investment instead of property and holdings.
To use investment. Okay. David prefers investment rather than property. Okay. Now, she talks about the different, how the interrelationship between nationalism and imperialism. And a great line here: in theory, there is an abyss between nationalism and imperialism. In practice, it can and has been bridged by tribal nationalism and outright racism. So he says that you can be nationalist without being imperialist. There should be an abyss between them. Nationalism just means you care about your nation, whereas imperialism means you want to control other nations. But it's tribal nationalism, where I care about my nation so much I don't care about other people's, and racism, where I see myself as just superior to other people's, is what abysses the two, what connects, what bridges over the abyss, because then I need to lord it over other people's in order for my people to succeed. So those are the elements that she ties together. There's then an important section where she talks about the rise of both the bourgeoisie and the mob. The bourgeoisie, which she's understanding as the educated middle class, that they only become a significant political element with the rise of imperialism, because you need this bureaucratic class to govern, to go out and govern these vast empires, right, rather than just the landed aristocracy that sits on their land. And the mob, which is the growth of the populace, is considered she traces that as a mirror development of the bourgeoisie. That you have this underclass, the laboring class, that is just always envious and of the power that's given to the bureaucrats, where they don't feel represented by the bureaucrats. Okay, and then this is the end of that section, where she writes, the idea of humanity, of which the most conclusive symbol is the common origin of the human species, is no longer valid. If it's no longer valid, then nothing is more plausible, right? When it starts leading when nationalism leads to imperialism, which leads to tribalism, which leads to racism, then you start to deny the common origin of humanity. Right, that we are all come from a common origin. This was the passage, if any of you attended the program a couple Sundays ago that Imam Hamza and I led, when we both taught that Jewish teaching that got into the Quran as well, that we all come from one human being. Right, because when that starts to be denied, right, if the idea of humanity, of which the most conclusive symbol is the common origin of the human species, is no longer valid, then nothing is more plausible than a theory according to which brown, yellow, or black races are descended from some other species of apes than the white race, and that altogether are predestined by nature to war against each other until they have disappeared from the face of the earth. Racism may indeed carry out the doom of the Western world, and for that matter, the whole of human civilization, right? That is going to, because it's destroying the idea of humanity. If it doesn't destroy actual peoples physically, it destroys the idea of a humanity, right? When you divide up humans into different types of humans. When Russians have become Slavs, when Frenchmen have assumed the role of commanders of a force noire, when Englishmen have turned into white men, as already for a disastrous spell all Germans became Aryans, then this change will itself signify the end of Western man. For no matter what learned scientists may say, race is, politically speaking, not the beginning of humanity, but its end. Not the origin of peoples, but their decay. Not the natural birth of man, but his unnatural death. And then that leads right into the next chapter, which is called Race Thinking Before Racism. Yeah, Nadine. Mm-hmm. Right, so the question is whether it's linear, whether you need imperialism to get to racism. She thinks you do, because she doesn't recognize racism in the classical world. For example, most classicists say there's no such thing as racism. You don't have a prejudice against people of different skin pigmentation in the classical world, or even the medieval world, the same way that you have in the modern world. So the way that she traces it is it's the European. She focuses really over the race to control Africa, and before that, the slave trade. You know, that there is this distinction of certain peoples as superior over other peoples. And then what happens, then it's really just in the period of the 1880s and 90s when you have the development of racism as a science, that science that's then used to support those political prejudices of the ultranationalism. So she's tracing a linear development there. You don't have to buy it, but that's the argument that she's making. It is a very Western approach. Correct. Her approach is Western. The argument is that it's a Western approach, and that's correct. That's why she says she says the doom of the Western world, right? So she's speaking about, she is not, her linear development of civilization is not a global history. It's not a global theory. She's focusing on the Western world because it's the Western world that was on the verge of destroying the planet in the 1950s. Right, because that's when the growth of the nuclear weapons, and also it's the Western world, and it's and she obviously talking about communist Russia also, but her real task is to explain how, and this is her background, right, as a German emigre, right, how Germany, which always prided itself as the seat of Western culture, or the most, that could bring itself to the lowest point of barbarity. So that's her project, right? She's explaining how can this culture, European culture, develop so much where it then goes so low, which is the opposite of sort of the Hegelian, like scaling in the belief in progress, right? That was World War I kind of brings that challenge, like we thought things were getting better and better and better, and then they got terrible, and then in the Holocaust it's even more so. But there is a Western perspective there, absolutely. Okay, so let me. So she talks about the difference between ideology and opinion. She says an ideology differs from a simple opinion in that it claims to possess either the key to history or the solution for all the riddles of the universe, or the intimate knowledge of the hidden universal laws which are supposed to rule nature and man. So that in ideology, she says, opinions are wonderful, ideologies are dangerous, she says, because an ideology is you use this perspective is the way you understand everything. And she's speaking about racism, which is and communism. She's addressing both, right? That both are ways to explain everything in the universe, and when the worst development of each, Nazi Germany in the case of racism and Stalinist Russia in the case of communism. Now, there's a difference there, of course, because communism has some positive elements to it. Racism has no positive elements to it. But she sees both as, she's trying to equate the two as the problem that when you have an ideology that then no matter what the facts are, you bend reality in order to explain it according to your cipher. So you're no longer being critical about how you understand the world, which is probably the opposite of what Marx intended to do, because he was trying to be a critical thinker and understand the world in a new way. Okay. And then this is understanding, she's talking about both racism and communism. It says, witnessing the gigantic competition between race thinking and class thinking, right? Racism and communism is class thinking, for dominion over the minds of modern men. Some have been inclined to see in the one, that's racism, the expression of national, and in other, communism, the expression of international trends. Because the Germans say, like, this is for the master race, and the Soviets said this is the international, But to believe the one to be the mental preparation for national wars, and communism, the other to be the ideology for civil wars. This has been possible because of the First World War's curious mixture of old national and new imperialistic conflicts, a mixture in which old national slogans prove still to possess a far greater appeal to the masses of all countries involved than any imperialistic aims. The last war, however, that's World War II, with its quislings and collaborationists everywhere, should have proved that racism can stir up civil conflicts in every country, and is one of the most ingenious devices ever invented for preparing civil war. So she says, don't think that racism is just a tool of a nation. Racism destroys a nation no more than communism, which, understand, that brought about the civil war in Russia, like the whites and the reds. But she's saying, no, it brought out a civil war. Racism brought a civil war where Germans turned against each other, right? And then she lost her statehood, which we're going to get to in a minute. Yeah.
The undercurrent to a lot of this is beginning in the 1870s, the whole eugenics movement, which took off.
The eugenics movement is the scientific element of racism, correct, which Develte said. That's exactly what she's talking about. Yeah, correct. So she writes, German race thinking was invented in an effort to unite the people against foreign domination. Right? And that was how it was used. So it's a intellectual development, it's a scientific development. The Nazis and others before the Nazis, right, used it as a political tool in order to sort of unite us against them, right? And that's the danger of race thinking, which is her term for racism. Okay, I'm going to move along to get to the stuff that I want to talk. Yes, good. It's the economics drive the political. Right. It's an economic issue that drives the racism, not a... Right. 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 But her argument is then that creates the divisions between humanity. Right. But it can be driven. Right. And her... I'm like obviously abbreviating because I'm trying to get through 200 pages of theory, but yes, it's the economic impulse. That's why I had that one section about the urge to property eventually brings you to want to destroy everything else, because it's this economic incentive that's built into the capitalist system of needing to acquire more and more that brings one to then lord over other peoples. And where a Marxist historian is going to focus on the class oppression that leads, she's focusing on the oppression of one people over another people through imperialism. So she's understanding that as sort of, which then leads and then devolves. So that's the argument she's making exactly. So it starts from economic roots. Yes, David.
Following that, somewhere around the 1400s, the power of the merchant class, which is capitalism, business,
Right.
and whatnot, is kind of displacing the landowning classes.
Right. Well, the displacement of a landowning class is also the growth, right. It's the growth of the mercantile class, of the financiers, of the bourgeoisie, that they start to acquire property and power at the expense of the landed aristocracy also. So that also is all a part of this huge growth of new types of wealth, absolutely. Here we go. Back to this the dangers of ideology. She says, ideologists who pretend to possess the key to reality are forced to change and twix their opinions about single cases according to the latest events and can never afford to come into conflict with their ever-changing ever-changing a deity reality. It would be absurd to ask people to be reliable who by their very convictions must justify any given situation. Right? That's incredibly pressing, especially for our own times as well. Right? You're saying that when you're driven by an ideology, facts are inconvenient. And you just interpret them or change them however you want to adjust to your ideology. So the ideology is no longer explaining the facts. You use the facts to explain your ideology. It's a reverse of what should be the critical approach, which she argues in so much of her other writings. Ed? Right. She's very right. She's not thinking as asking about artificial intelligence, right? Obviously, that's before her time. She's just writing in the 50s and like the beginning of the space race and nuclear technology. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, like the term, yeah. But they're still driven by bad human ideas, right? And that's the point. And racism is a bad idea, goes in the list of those bad ideas. So here at the end of this section, she says, imperialism would have been necessitated. So this is the connection with Nadine's question about is it linear, imperialism leading to racism. So she writes, imperialism would have necessitated the invention of racism as the only possible explanation and excuse for its deeds, even if no race thinking had ever existed in the civilized world. That's her version on Voltaire. It would have been necessary to invent God if there weren't a God. She's saying if they didn't have racism, they would have needed to invent it. Actually, there already was racism that they could build on. But her argument is that imperialism needs racism in order to justify how one nation is superior to another nation and can just extract whatever it wants from that other nation for its own purposes. Okay, that is the end of that section. Let me move a bit forward here. She writes no matter whether racism appears as the natural result of a catastrophe or the conscious instrument for bringing it about, it is always closely tied to contempt for labor, hatred of territorial limitation, general rootlessness, and an activistic faith in one's own divine chosenness. That is driven by a sense of, I've been wronged by history, but God really has chosen me. And that's what's driving the nationalist superiority that you find over other peoples. And she doesn't explain this out, but that's really how the Nazis came to power, because it was a ideology based upon that in the wake of Germany's defeat in World War I. It's like it's a struggle between peoples, and we have to right that defeat and reestablish our superiority. And then, okay, Tova, and then we're going to go on to something else. Yes. Yes.
Just along the lines of what you said.
Right.
So I just wonder, we don't.
Yes.
There's not the idea that we are necessarily superior to others, are they?
You're picking up, Tova, on exactly the dark undertone of Hannah Arendt, which is why she gets controversial in Eichmann in Jerusalem. And my point is that had anyone really read her, they would have known that there's nothing in Eichmann Jerusalem that is not in her theoretical writings before. And we also talked about the few articles she wrote as Israel is being established. She stopped saying it explicitly. I'll show you a few places here where she can't help herself. She sees any type of nationalism as dangerous. She sees Zionist. She saw herself as a Zionist. And but she saw that she wanted the state to be a federation of peoples. She thought the idea of a Jewish state that preferenced the Jews over the Arab people was a walking time bomb, and that was her argument in 1947. So and we'll Right, yeah, but it goes into theory here. She says that a nation state is ultimately a problematic structure. She wants a different type of structure, and people either say that she was naive or she was correct, right? Which is sort of the same thing, right? Because either way means there's something wrong with the way things are today. In a different section, it's a beautiful section. It talks about legends versus about the problem with ideology, and she compares it. She's always comparing how the modern world is bad and the classical world was wonderful, because she's a classicist, so she idealized the Greek and Roman period. And she says there you had a legend that explained the reason, for a state, like legends of the founding of Rome, for example. And she says, without ever relating facts reliably, yet always expressing their true significance, they offered a truth beyond realities, a remembrance beyond memories, which I thought was just a beautiful sentence of what a legend is supposed to do, as a fable without ever relating facts reliably, yet always expressing their true significance, legends offered a truth beyond realities, a remembrance beyond memories. That's the end of a paragraph. She fleshes it out, the paragraph before. Oh, yeah. She's saying that she wants a different kind of structure. And then she's comparing that with ideologies, where ideologies are the legend doesn't, her point is a legend doesn't pretend to be truthful, to be factual. The legend is just giving you the basic idea. It's like George Washington chops down the cherry tree and then can't tell a lie, right? So it's not trying to abuse facts. It's just saying this is not factual. This is a legend. So, and then in the end of that section, and if we had time, I would read you the whole page because it's just beautiful. She says, legends attract the very best in our times, just as ideologies attract the average. And the whispered tales of gruesome secret powers behind the scenes attract the very worst, right? So that's where ideology turns into just, counterfactual prejudice. Like, that's anti-Semitism. That's right. The idea, the Jews are secretly controlling everything, right? That's the word. That's when you can have an ideology that is not necessarily evil, but when the ideology turns into anti-Semitism that has no basis in reality whatsoever, that's the lowest point, the very worst. Yeah.
Similarly, the greatness of our founding fathers, this is the land of freedom, is being undercut by, but they were all, or some of them, many of them, slaveholders.
Yes, correct, which is an argument of being slave. Yeah, that's a whole different issue. So just a point here about bureaucracy, and then we have time for it gets more interesting. But she says, bureaucracy is always a government of experts, of an experienced minority, which has to resist as well as it knows how the constant pressure from the inexperienced majority. This is her issue that the rise of bureaucracy leads us to the oppression of others. Because this is the educated class that thinks, I need to govern these other peoples because they can't govern themselves. Each people is fundamentally an inexperienced majority and can therefore not be trusted with such a highly specialized matter as politics and public affairs, right? And when you translate that into governing other peoples in an imperialist context, it's what then that devolves into dangerous racism and prejudice. Okay, so now moving in a chapter. So she talks about continental imperialism. This is called, and the Pan movements. And I'm going to, here we go. Consciousness of nationality is a comparatively recent development. The structure of the state was derived from centuries of monarchy and enlightened despotism. Whether the form of a new republic or of a reformed constitutional monarchy, the state inherited as its supreme function the protection of all its inhabitants in its territory, no matter what their nationality, and was supposed to act as a supreme legal institution. She's making the distinction here between the state versus the nation. The state is supposed to govern and protect everyone in it. And that was the sort of historical error, quote unquote, of the Jews, as being, in the development of anti-Semitism was her argument in part one, that the Jews were always the best subjects of the state because they were 100% loyal to the state, because the state protected them because they weren't a part of a nation with any power. So she writes, the tragedy of the nation state was that the people's rising national consciousness interfered with these functions of the state's purpose to protect everyone. In the name of the will of the people, the state was forced to recognize only nationals as citizens, to grant full civil and political rights only to those who belong to the national community by right of origin and fact of birth. This meant that the state was partly transformed from an instrument of the law into an instrument of the nation. That's the key to her theory here, right? That the state becomes a servant of the nation rather than a protector of the people that live in a certain area. The state becomes politicized. If we think about it, the old European structure, which we see in Israel as well, which is a good structure, is where you have a distinction between the head of state and the head of government, right? And the idea there is that the state, the head of government, like the prime minister, is representing the political majority, which you need in order to govern in a democracy. But then the head of state, be it the president of Israel, the King of England, the Governor General of Canada, the President of Germany, represents everyone. The head of state, it says the state is above politics. And that system is supposed to maintain that distinction. And her argument is that in any nation state, that's why we call it just a figurehead. When you call the head of state a figurehead, then it means that the state is already lost, because the state is just controlled by the majority, which is, and our only solution to that in this country is the balance of power, between the different branches of government. Okay, so, and what? Well, we'll get there. We're going to get to Bill of Rights, because she's going to get there. So she talks about there's a national trinity in the Western world of people, territory, state, right? And that's the dangerous trinity of that Western, that develops, that a nation, a people needs a territory and needs a state. That a territory and a state are what a people deserves. Yeah, she's not mentioning Zionism, but that's the undercurrent there. That's the danger that her argument is you should be able, there's nothing wrong with being a people, that's a culture. But you should be able to be a people, you don't need a territory, you don't need a state. Let the state protect everybody. Naive, utopian, but that's her point, that's her critique of where things went and are going in her time. She talks about the difference between nationalism and racism. Nationalism, its concept of a national mission, perverted the national concept of mankind as a family of nations into a hierarchical structure where differences of history and organization were misinterpreted as differences between men residing in natural origin. Racism, which denied the common origin of man and repudiated the common purpose of establishing humanity, introduced the concept of the divine origin of one people as contrasted with all others, thereby covering the temporary and changeable product of human endeavor with a pseudo-mystical cloud of divine eternity and finality, right? That's the danger, that nationalism leads to racism, which then leads to the worst, leads to the camps. Everything she's arguing is what leads to the camps. The appeal, and then this is being driven by tribal isolation. Tribal isolation and the master race ambitions was partly due to an instinctive feeling that mankind, whether a religious or humanistic ideal, implies a common sharing of responsibility. So her point is that if you understand that we're all one humanity, then we're all responsible for each other. But if you go towards the avenue of tribal nationalism, then you're only concerned with your people. So the more that you turn towards nationalism, the less you give up of the responsibility for everyone. Now, not everything goes to the extremes and negative, but just a contemporary example, there's not a lot of differences today between Reform Judaism and Conservative Judaism, but the difference in culture that's often pointed out is that Conservative Judaism emphasizes more the nationalist elements of Judaism, Hebrew language, more Hebrew, more connection for Israel. Not that you don't have those things in the Reform movement. The Reform movement emphasizes more tikkun olam, social justice. Not that you don't have that in Conservative Judaism. Reform critiques itself that we focus so much on the universalism that we lose any connection to Jewish particularism, so it's very hard to have continuity in the next generation. The self-critique in the conservative world is we focus so much on the intra-Jewish issues that we don't have the same commitment towards the human race as a whole that we have in the Reform movement, which is just to say the grass is always greener on the other side. But that tension, right, between universalism and particularism is what she's talking with also, right? You can't, she's not saying there should be no nation, there should be no nationalism, and that because then the world gets boring. She's just saying that we have to be mindful of where it can lead. Tribalism and racism are the very realistic, if very destructive ways of escaping the predicament of common responsibility. And then she talks about the Jews specifically, and she said why, that especially in the dual monarchy, right, the Jews were the perfect people to be in a state that wasn't a nation, and that's why the other nations hated the Jews so much. And she then talks about that anti-Semitism is basically a form of envy. It's jealousy because the Jews have a place, right? They, in a sense, are a people. They don't have a state. They don't have a country. They don't have a state. But they're obviously a people that have a strong identity, and they have a footing in the world. Which again, from a post-Zionist, not post-Zionist, post-1948 perspective, is hard for us to think about Judaism in that way. I did mention at the beginning of the class that book that just came out by Daniel Boyarin, the Talmud scholar from Berkeley, who's an anti-Zionist, where he's called The No State Solution, where I think Wayne picked me up and was reading it. He might be watching, where he argues that really, Judaism does not need a Jewish state to survive. He's making his argument, okay. And then remember I pointed out that he has this one point where he misquotes Hannah Arendt. He said she was also an ultra-nationalist. Even though she had good modern ideas, she gave to the Jewish Defense League, which is, and I said he was wrong, right? That was a mistake in the biographer of Hannah Arendt. I wanted to write to Boyarin. I forced myself to finish Boyarin's book before I wrote to him. So I finished it a couple of weeks ago. I wrote to him with the page it's a footnote of the preface of the second edition of the biography, where Elizabeth Young Burrell says, this was a mistake that I made. I mixed up JDL, I meant UJA. But Edward Said, who is the Palestinian intellectual from Columbia, quoted her mistake and wouldn't correct it. And I know where Boyarin got it, even though he doesn't quote it. So I sent this to him. He responded to my email within 2 minutes. And he writes, "Zero, fine. Thank you for this. I don't know how to correct it because it's a whole page in the book. But every time I speak, I will explain my mistake and express my regret for saying this." Daniel, so that was cool. Yeah. The second edition, yeah. All right, let's see. We got 15 minutes for the end here. I got another 50 pages moving forward here. Blah, blah. Oh, no, we're moving along. Look at this. Now we got 40 pages left. Okay, the last chapter is called The Decline of the Nation State and the End of the Rights of Man. And there's a few sections here that I want to go, and then it leads into the section that you have. The representatives of the great nations knew only too well that minorities within nation states must sooner or later be either assimilated or liquidated, right? That's the problem, that you can have a nation state, and you can have a Bill of Rights, and you can pretend as much as you want that we protect everyone, but really we don't. In the whole idea of a nation state is really the intolerance for other peoples. Like I have, and we see that tension for that even in our own country, right? The Arab population in France, that's the real issue in France, right? The challenge between, does being French meaning the rights of man, which is universal, or does being French mean you are an element, you are French, which you can't be if you're Arab and you're black, or et cetera, and the same thing in this country, right? Is there something that means American? And, there was opposition to President Obama that had nothing to do with his politics, right? And there's that element of like and those tensions are there, right? It's the same tension that we see in France, same thing we see in Israel, right? So she writes here and then that brings her to the argument of so the nation had long conquered the state. National interest had priority over law long before Hitler could pronounce right is what is good for the German people. This is all before the rise of Hitler. She said this is just the idea of the state has lost because the nation has taken over the state. And then she leads her to what she calls the problem of the stateless people. And this is where her analysis is so telling, as because she became a stateless person when she had to leave Germany. Right, and remember at one of the very first classes, I read from you this interview she gave with a German journalist when she said, what remains is the language, right? That Germanness was always a part of her. Even though she wrote in English, she thought in German, the language remained, but she had no connection with the territory, with the state of Germany. The only connection she had was with the language. And that's a very, very talented. So here she writes, no paradox of contemporary politics is filled with a more poignant irony than the discrepancy between the efforts of well-meaning idealists who stubbornly insist on regarding as inalienable those human rights which are enjoyed only by citizens of the most prosperous and civilized countries, and the situation of the rightless themselves. Their situation has deteriorated just as stubbornly until the internment camp prior to the Second World War. The exception rather than the rule for the stateless has become the routine solution for the problem of domicile of the displaced persons. This is her critique of the Bill of Rights, and more importantly, of the rights of man and the citizen in the French Revolution. The idea that everyone has certain basic rights that are inalienable. They're only inalienable as long as the nation gives it to you. Once the nation stops providing it, then you become stateless. Human rights doesn't mean anything. So the post-war term displaced persons was invented during the war for the express purpose of liquidating statelessness once and for all by ignoring its existence. Here's another one. The first great damage done to the nation states as a result of the arrival of hundreds of thousands of stateless people was that the right of asylum, the only right that had ever figured as a symbol of the rights of man in the sphere of international relationships, was being abolished. Its long and sacred history dates back to the very beginnings of regulated political life. It's one of, even the Greeks, everyone understood the right of asylum. That was an ancient right, even before before the Enlightenment. And then when you have the whole idea of a displaced person, it means that we don't recognize the right of asylum. We think about that today, right? That no human being has the right to just have asylum in any other country, right? And the whole issue and it's not just about immigration, but it raises, and she explains that there's an issue when you have so many people that a country can't absorb, right, the pragmatic problem. But she's looking at it as systemic. When we don't just recognize the right of asylum and we call the person as just displaced, that means, they're not our problem. That means that we don't really believe in human rights. That's the challenge that she's posing there, even for the Western countries. She's not criticizing Nazi Germany. She's criticizing the Western states for, establishing DP camps, deciding that, now, it worked in our favor because it was one of the reasons why the majority of the countries of the world in the UN voted for the state of Israel, because it got them off the hook with having to absorb all of the DPs from all the displaced persons, hundreds of thousands of Jews that had no place to go, right? Where she's saying, if it's a human right, then it's a human right. Let's hold the question, because I just want to make sure that I finish this, and then we'll take as much time as we want. A government for whom there is no appropriate niche in the framework of the general law is an outlaw by definition. Right? It says, a man without a state was an anomaly for whom there is no appropriate niche in the framework of the general law. And then she makes, the Second World War and the DP camps were not necessary to show that the only practical substitute for a non-existent homeland was an internment camp. Indeed, as the early 30s, this was the only country in the world the only country the world had to offer the stateless. And then she makes a fascinating point where she says that you would have been better to be a criminal than a stateless person, right? She says, for example, if you were a West Coast Japanese American who was in jail when the army ordered the internment of all Americans of Japanese ancestry, you would not have been forced to liquidate property at too low a price. He would have remained right where he was, armed with a lawyer to look after his interests. And if he was so lucky as to receive a long sentence, he might have returned righteously and peacefully to his former business and profession, even that of a professional thief. His jail sentence guaranteed him the constitutional rights that nothing else, no protests of loyalty and no appeals could have obtained for him once his citizenship had become doubtful. Saying a criminal still has rights. But once you lose your statehood, and the state says you're not my problem, that's worse than being a criminal. Because as a criminal, the state is still protecting you, even when you're in prison. And then I want to read you this section, because the reason why I started this whole, talking about Hannah Arendt was because of Dara Horn's argument in her chapter on Varian Fry that she also gave a version of last Yom HaShoah a year ago. Right, where she was criticizing Hannah Arendt for failing to acknowledge Varian Fry as freeing her. Here you're going to see why it was so hard for her to do so. She writes, a much less reliable and more difficult way to rise from an unrecognized anomaly, the stateless person, to the status of recognized exception would to become a genius. A genius was the only way to get treated well as a stateless person. Just as the law knows only one difference between human beings, the difference between the normal non-criminal and the anomalous criminal, so a conformist society has recognized only one form of determined individualism, the genius. European bourgeois society wanted the genius to stay outside of human laws, to be a kind of monster whose chief social function was to create excitement and to not matter if he actually was an outlaw. Moreover, the loss of citizenship, and by the way, her point about outlaw is saying that it's worse than the criminal, right? The outlaw is a stateless person because you're outside the law, right? You're not protected. Moreover, the loss of citizenship deprived people not only of protection, but also of all clearly established, officially recognized identity, a fact for which their eternal, feverish efforts to obtain at least birth certificates from the country that denationalized them was a very exact symbol. One of their problems was solved when they achieved the degree of distinction that will rescue a man from the huge and nameless crowd. Only fame will eventually answer the repeated complaint of refugees of all social strata that nobody here knows who I am. And it is true that the chances of the famous refugee are improved, just as a dog with a name has a better chance to survive than a stray dog who is just a dog in general. But we should care about dogs in general. We shouldn't give any more preference to a dog with a name. So that's her point, right? That we shouldn't only care about geniuses. And that was her problem with Varian Fry. And if you remember when we talked last year, read that it was the novel, oh my God, what's her name? But it was the portfolio something, right? The Flight Portfolio, thank you, Linda. The author there makes the very, in her historical fiction, she makes the critique of it. She has Varian Fry express guilt as tearing him apart, that why am I only rescuing geniuses? I don't know that the Varian Fry himself made any of those arguments, but I think this is the key, and this is what Dara Horn she didn't read this, doesn't understand that this is Hannah Arendt's, this is probably why she couldn't acknowledge Varian Fry, because she was so uncomfortable with that. The idea that you would just rescue geniuses is part of the problem, is the denial of universal human rights, right? Okay, now there is a point where she talks specifically about Israel, and this is 10 pages towards the end of the part 2 here. She says, that the notion of statelessness is primarily a Jewish problem was a pretext used by all governments who tried to settle the problem by ignoring it. And then she talks about how the solution to that problem, we have a state of Israel that solves Jewish statelessness. But the solution to the Jewish question merely produced a new category of refugees, the Arabs, thereby increasing the number of the stateless and rightless by another 700 to 800,000 people. And that's what happened in Palestine within the smallest territory. And then she's back, and then she says and then she makes it in general that the nation state cannot exist once its principle of equality before the law is broken down. That is going to be a challenge for any state, right? You have to enforce. Now, true, in the state of Israel, they do concretize the right of all citizens in the Declaration of Independence, which is a big issue in Israel because it's not clear what the legal status of the Declaration of Independence is. The refugees, right, the Palestinian refugees who were not native to inside the Greenland of Israel before 48 are stateless, right? And that's part of the whole problem. And that's the structural problem with the nation state that she's defining. If you're stateless, right, there are Arabs who have Israeli citizenship, and then there are Arabs who don't have Israeli citizenship, but they're not citizens of any other state either. And that's the issue. That's the systemic problem that she's describing here, and it got a lot worse since then. But she's saying it's not just a problem in Israel, it's a problem with the nation state in general. And that's the point of this section. And finally now I'm up to the section, The Perplexities of the Right of Man, which you have in this book. So you can read this last section. I'll just read you a few key parts. The implication of the identification of the rights of man with the rights of peoples in the European nation-state system came to light only when a growing number of people and peoples, suddenly appeared whose elementary rights were as little safeguarded by the ordinary functioning of nation-states in the middle of Europe as they would have been in the heart of Africa. The rights of man, after all, had been defined as inalienable because they were supposed to be independent of all governments. But it turned out that the moment human beings lacked their own government and had to fall back upon their minimum rights, no authority was left to protect them, and no institution was willing to guarantee them. And here you see that's her own experience, right? That she lost her state, and she was at the whim of luck. The stateless people were as convinced as the minorities that loss of national rights was identical with loss of human rights, that the former inevitably entailed the latter. And that's her point when she says the end of the rights of man, that in a nation state you cannot really have a rights of human rights. That when because a nation is really caring just about its people, is not caring about universal human rights. It's a systemic problem with the political system of nation states. That's the argument of this section. And then, hold on. They are deprived not of the right of freedom, but of the right to action. Okay, I'll skip that one. Here we go. And then she talks about slavery. Slavery's crime against humanity did not begin when one people defeated and enslaved its enemies, though of course that was bad enough. But when slavery became an institution in which some men were born free and others slave, when it was forgotten that it was man who had deprived his fellow men of freedom, and when the sanction for the crime was attributed to nature, right? So that's the issue, right? When it's considered natural that as I'm born into a nation. She talks elsewhere, there's just 4 more pages here. I don't know if it's here, if not I'll say it, where she says it's the element where nation states often give preference to people, citizens that are born in the state rather over naturalized citizens, whether naturalized citizens are real Americans. Even in this country, right? The idea that you have to be a naturalized born citizen in order to be president, right? And that was the whole issue with Obama, with whether, Trump was contending that he wasn't born in the United States, the birth certificate thing. Well, that's the issue. It says that has nothing to do with nothing to do with a state with law. That's nationalism. Finally, not only did the loss of national rights in all instances entail the loss of human rights, the restoration of human rights, as the recent example of the State of Israel proves, has achieved so far only through the restoration or the establishment of national rights. And this is going to become essential when we talk about Eichmann Jerusalem, because she makes a distinction there between whether Eichmann, she said Eichmann, her point was that he should be tried for crimes against humanity. And she criticized the state for trying Eichmann for crimes against the Jewish people. She said it should have been crimes against humanity. And she agreed with the death sentence for Eichmann. She just said it was a violation of humanity. And that's it's fine distinction that we'll get to. Okay. Equality, in contrast to all that is involved in mere existence, is not given us, but is the result of human organization insofar as it is guided by the principle of justice. We are not born equal. We become equal as members of a group on the strength of our decision to guarantee ourselves mutually equal rights. So that's just, so she said, let's forget, there's no human rights, inalienable human rights doesn't mean anything. She says, so here's where you know that she's not naive. She's not an idealist. She's saying she's very pragmatic. She says the only way to establish equality is to form organizations that are willing to defend it. And then at the very end of the section, she says, the deadly danger to any civilization is no longer likely to come from without. Nature has been mastered. No barbarians threaten to destroy what they cannot understand as the Mongolians threatened Europe for centuries. By the way, I don't think she's fair to the Mongolians there, but okay. Even the emergence of totalitarian governments is a phenomenon within, not outside our civilization. The danger is that a global, universally interrelated civilization may produce barbarians from its own midst by forcing millions of people into conditions which, despite all appearances, are the conditions of savages. Because the term barbarian from the classical world means people from the outside, like the Mongolians from the perspective of the Europeans. And her point is that the Germans, who were the most civilized of all Europeans, became barbarians because they treated their fellow citizens as savages, like herself, by eliminating their human rights. And that's the danger of where, that's her argument of where things go, where the imperialism leads into a totalitarian system. And that's the bridge to the last part, which is her description of the totalitarian state. So the next class, I'm going to summarize part 3, which is the last part of Origins, which is on totalitarianism. And if you want to read, she has one section on that, one chapter in the one volume, which is the part called and on the part 3, totalitarianism, domination, total domination, page 119 of the one volume. I think that's If it's not the last chapter, it's the second to last chapter in the totalitarianism section. So, yeah, let's take two questions, David and then Tova.
I'm not sure where the issue of human rights comes from, except if it's guaranteed or implemented by the country that you're in.
So David's saying that, I'm just going to summarize because I got students waiting in a hallway upstairs. But they're human right. She says they're not inalienable, that's naive, right? And that's her critique of the Enlightenment. She's saying they're not inalienable. They're not natural rights. All rights are social. They're given by the society. But she says the idea of human rights should come from the idea that we're all one human race, that no human is superior to any other, and that understanding, that collective universal responsibility should bring us to build a society to create the structures where everyone is protected. And it's her experience and that's why the biography is important, of being a stateless person that made it so poignant to her, the systemic problems that we could say, we have universal rights and we have Declaration of Rights, we have Bill of Rights. None of it means anything if the government doesn't protect you. So so it doesn't come from anywhere except the idea of common peoplehood, or the human race, right? The common humanity among people is where it comes from. Tova.
One of the things that struck me is when you were talking about people being absorbed, you were talking about Japanese and how
Right.
individuals are absorbed. And it just, what popped into my mind was the concept of the Borg in the Star Trek. No, I know, but it's that same.
Where you're assimilate, right? Where you're individual. So I was saying the Star Trek, the Borg, where you lose all individual. It's the collective completely over the individual, right? And that might be applicable in the argument totalitarianism of Stalin's Russia, where the individual is completely unimportant, right? And that's it. I thought you were going to go. The Japanese internment camp should make you think of not the next generation, should think of Mr. Sulu, because George Takei has written about his own family experience in a Japanese internment camp. And he's also, there's a graphic biography novel where it's right there in comic strip that he tells that story, which is very powerful. Last comments. Thank you for sticking with us. I don't remember when the next date is, but whenever that is, we go to part 3. So we have 3 classes left. So the next class is going to be part 3 on totalitarianism, and then after that we have 2 more sessions that we'll devote to Eichmann and Jerusalem and the controversies over that. So I'll see you then.